To begin this course, I'd like to do a little bit of a historical perspective on SharePoint. We're talking about how we actually do integration and development with SharePoint 2013. But as you go through your processes of requirements gathering, as you look at the different ways of integrating with SharePoint, as you may review your legacy code base from previous versions of SharePoint, it helps to understand how all of that has fit in. Even if you're a person who just simply goes out and does internet searches on various different techniques, which you probably will be doing as you get deeper into the SharePoint processes, it helps to understand when things look a little bit odd, that there's probably a reason and what those reasons may be. If you're someone who'd like to jump directly into the hows of development, you're quite welcome to skip this section. But this is actually here to help you with some of the whys. When you talk with those business owners, when you talk with those end users that have been maybe working with SharePoint for a while, that you may be going into a situation where there's already an installed base of a previous version of SharePoint and things look a little bit interesting. This section is here to help you understand why some of those choices were made, help you evaluate if those were good choices for the time or if maybe things weren't done quite as well, and to understand how you can actually make use of the most of those previous versions of SharePoint, pulling it forward, hopefully into your updated content for SharePoint 2013. So that being said, let's kind of start with the history of SharePoint and move it up until today and how it's evolved. SharePoint started back in 1999, so we're looking at about 15 years of history for SharePoint right now, or getting close to it. And SharePoint was, at first, a group of technologies, as I like to say it, combined by a marketing term. SharePoint was actually two different initiatives that came out and needed each other, were the yin and the yang of some of the needs for enterprises at the time. SharePoint Portal Server, which was built as a document repository for departments inside of companies. This was built to be more accessible and easier to use, less training and a process than the then dominant network file share. Everything kind of got dumped out onto a drive and you could find it. SharePoint Portal Server was there to try and help bring in search, help bring in the ability to put metadata on the documents to help people organize them a little bit better and make them more accessible using these web technologies that were very new at the time, that were really kind of coming into the forefront of development processes. Then there was SharePoint Team Services, which was built around the concept that people were using the web for collaboration, using HTML pages for bringing in, maybe putting in task lists, putting in different types of information, and really kind of saying, everybody needs a list. We have a platform for creating lists of lists. And that piece kind of has stuck with SharePoint to today. It still is one of those common base foundational concepts that you'll see in all of SharePoint. So these two were kind of put out in beta at the time when Microsoft was doing one of its big transitions. One of the big confusions that you'll see from people of this era is that Microsoft SharePoint Server was released as one of the first wave of .NET servers. The problem with that is that at the time, .NET was just coming out and just being worked on, and SharePoint 2001 actually had no .NET code in it whatsoever, or no .NET infrastructures at all. Most of this generation of SharePoint was actually built on Exchange technology. SharePoint Portal Server did its data store with the Exchange public folders infrastructure, which was rather interesting. The user experience for both of them was on the WebPart framework that was just coming out of the Digital Dashboard Initiative. And so there was a lot of pieces that didn't kind of match up with the description. If you see anything based around this, definitely move off. This is something that has kind of been and gone. You're looking at something of the VB6 era. So This is again a bit of history. You'll have a lot of concerns about scalability on this. Search was basically SQL full text search or public folder search. Web parts were written in XML, HTML, CAML, collaboration application markup language, which is still around, which is a SQL-like language but it's as a domain-specific language, it has some challenges, and JavaScript, but not the JavaScript you're thinking of today, very far back in the deep mists of time. To do web part development, you literally uploaded the XML and the JavaScript into the data store, and it was pulled directly out from the data store, and had some fun with pushing things out and doing security and all the rest of those things that we normally think of are handled for us today. Customizations generally required modifying the single ASP file, and this was ASP old, not ASP.NET, and so that keeping your changes managed and keeping things in a supportable state was very, very much of a challenge. That being said, SharePoint 2001 was actually a pretty good success inside of organizations and enterprises. The need was so great for something like this that it was actually deployed out in many different areas, and it was fairly small and self-contained enough that there were projects that actually bundled up a SharePoint server as the documentation and as the history for this. Remember, this was before Team Foundation Server and the ability to keep everything pretty much atomic. So the ability to do things such as versioning on files and to be able to have tasks lists that could move around was one of the things that really kind of helped SharePoint take off and become the product it is today. Again, historical, this is one of those pieces that if you do run across it, it should be in a situation where you're getting all the data out and documenting what customizations were done there as you re-implement those greenfield. The next generation of SharePoint, 2003, was one of the big transition periods with SharePoint. It actually moved it over into ASP.NET, but not quite. There were still some things that were happening with ASP.NET 1.0 and 1.1 that fully didn't support all of the functionalities of SharePoint. So you had an iFilter registered into IIS. So there was actually processing done on top of ASP.NET, which meant that you had to treat SharePoint very differently than traditional ASP.NET applications. The web parts were control-based, and specifically in this generation, they were server control-based, so which many people really weren't that familiar with. There were some works that happened with smart parts and some others with some of the general community to wrap up user controls, which were the dominant way of creating controls in those days, inside to make use of SharePoint. Event handlers were introduced to be able to actually have things kicked off and actually have register events inside of SharePoint so that, say, when a file got uploaded, you could actually have something run. If you're going through the web part approach, then you could have that happen, but then there are other ways of getting into SharePoint through the web services or through the web dev interface that would not kick off web parts or would not involve those. So having event handlers meant that now there was integration possible. You could actually have things happen no matter where that information came in. You could actually have your code run and handle pieces. One of the big challenges with this, though, is that it was all run asynchronously, so that you had to think about things in terms of being notified that something had already happened rather than being able to take action through that pipeline. So be aware of that as it came together. This was ASP.NET 1.0 and then updated to 1.1. So you could actually roll through, and Visual Studio was now being able to understand what SharePoint was doing, but note that you generally had to work with SharePoint very closely, and it was a very specialized skill to do with SharePoint. The object model that was introduced had a lot of adjustments for web developers to work with. One of the biggest challenges that had come in at this point and really stays with SharePoint to this day is the security model. SharePoint allows different access levels inside of SharePoint itself, and developers as we know, we traditionally do tend to run with high levels of access. Having things not work in SharePoint with access causes a lot of challenges, especially with 2003. What this means is that you'll hear a lot of people who've worked with SharePoint 2003 and what we'll talk about in a minute, 2007, had issues with custom code having the capability of taking down the entire page. Because of the structure, if your code threw an exception, you would generally take out the entire page itself, so that there was a huge pushback of don't change SharePoint. Don't put any custom code in SharePoint because of how brittle the infrastructure itself was. And add that with the security model, which meant that sometimes you could see an object, but when you tried to actually read it, you would throw exceptions, and security exceptions were a lot of the ways that you found out if you had access or not. Exception trapping was hugely important and hugely challenging to get all of the different things that you could run into. So know that 2003 is where development in SharePoint kind of really began, but it was also fraught with a lot of challenges and a lot of risks. And so if you've got in companies that have used SharePoint from this time period, you're probably going to get a lot of pushback about pushing up custom DLLs or pushing up custom code that may cause problems. So if you've got infrastructure people, they're going to be some of the more cautious people about allowing you to put information into their servers. So be aware of that. With 2007, it was updated for .NET 2.0, which had the lovely side effect of meaning that you were bumping your DLLs and your runtime quite a bit. And so compatibility back and forth between 2003 and 2007 was challenging. Again, not really helping with the stability and not really helping with the how robust SharePoint as a development platform was. You could quite well do that, but especially with things moving quickly and a lot of this happening as SharePoint itself was growing and documentation was coming out and people were learning it, know that there was a lot of challenges moving between those generations. The nice thing, though, was with 2007, SharePoint became a native ASP.NET experience. That means that the iFilter was removed. You actually ran as a .NET application. And so now things became a lot easier to do. I say it's a .NET application. That still means that the back end was SQL based and that a lot of things didn't happen on the web front end file system, which was one of the big challenges with SharePoint at the time. If you hear a concept called ghosting, that happened. That was one of the big concerns in SharePoint 2007 is for a performance enhancement, files that had not been changed that were originally from the templates were read off the local file system of the web front end. The challenge there is that if something was changed, then updating those files became a little bit challenging because sometimes they were pulled off of the file system, sometimes they were pulled out of the database, and there was a big push at this point to make sure that you could unghost or do things like that. For developers, especially if you're pushing out new web front ends or new HTML or new web parts, being able to figure out where you actually needed to do those updates or be able to push through and dump out all the caching became a big challenge. So you'll see things being very aggressively anti-cache in this time period. Workflow Foundation support happened. So at this point, you start seeing workflows being supported, but the management and usability of those workflows was really in its infancy. Being able to understand what a workflow meant, what was happening. You'll see workflows very, very primitive in this period, not because of the runtime, but because of the tools around those runtimes being able to put that into place. The packaging, SharePoint in 2003 was a lot of actually command line using some of the custom SharePoint admin tools to push up DLLs, to register them, to do strong naming. There was a lot of working with GUIDs, with SharePoint 2007, some of the tooling came up to make that a lot easier for the standard developer to work with. Being able to sign, you still had to have everything signed and pushed around, but being able to manage what's going on with there, to be able to do things such as feature stapling, to be able to actually do updates as you move through your code development, it became a lot easier. And the JavaScript object model happened. With 2001, everything was JavaScript, but it was all being run right there on the server on the client. 2003 kind of moved back into the ASP.NET era. Now SharePoint 2007 opens up that JavaScript object model, so you can actually do some things in the browser environment, be able to actually make your web pages more responsive. Again, this is very early in that push. You'll actually see situations in 2007 where you saw at the time it was WPFE, Silverlight was coming into place. You saw some pieces after SharePoint was released where Silverlight extensions or Silverlight web parts were actually pushed out as well. So don't be surprised if you see those kind of pieces happening here. And a lot of that was to provide richer, more active, a more responsive web front end, because in 2007 a lot of pieces came into place. You actually had content management server coming into SharePoint as well, which gave a lot of different capabilities, but SharePoint as a runtime environment was not as optimized or not as fast as a lot of users would like, and this is where SharePoint actually got a reputation for being a fairly slow environment. So be aware of that as you're looking at any historical code that you may look at, or people who are working solutions that come out of the SharePoint 2007 timeframe. With SharePoint 2010, a lot of the push has been to basically stabilize and build upon what happened with SharePoint 2007. If you think of SharePoint 2007 kind of as a 1.0, 2.0 release, SharePoint 2010 was probably a 1.5 release. It's a major release, but didn't really break things or change things around. It refined pieces and really did a lot of the tweaking that we really wanted to see. SharePoint 2010 was updated to .NET 3.5, bringing in all those capabilities there. Workflow Foundation changed over to 2.0, which caused some concerns because there were some fairly significant differences between Workflow Foundation 1.0 and 2.0, so you'll see some challenges from that area. Solutions were introduced as well. As you're packaging things up from SharePoint 2007, it became a little bit challenging to figure out what depended upon what and actually building features that needed features. Solutions allowed you to package up various features and put them together and actually deploy just an entire application based upon multiple features at the same time. So it made things a lot easier for the solutions developer to package up and make sure that things had been deployed in the right order and that all the dependencies had happened when they turned it over to operations. The client object models came into play. Before this, it was actually working through SOAP web services and RSS feeds, which took the place of REST interfaces for SharePoint. The client object model actually allowed you to work with SharePoint with a language-based wrapper, so that things became a lot easier to access. You became a lot more capable of putting things into place and made debugging, to be honest with you, a lot easier. So that came into place to make it easier for specifically for Office to tie into SharePoint, but if Office was using it, it was a document interface, so it came out to everyone else. So it became a opportunity for developers on the client to utilize SharePoint on the back end as the business or the storage environment. And then sandbox solutions happened in response to some of the challenges with SharePoint's brittleness on the server side. Sandbox solutions were actually run separately from the SharePoint task. They were managed so that things like a infinite loop wouldn't take down the server, that if there was something happening, that it was insulated to just what was going on in that solution, be it a web part, be it an event task, or whatever. It made that very easy for operations to understand what was going on, to kill tasks that were misbehaving, and to keep the server as a whole up and running. That being said, it's a very different way of development than you would natively or with the top level functionality, because you are running in a sandboxed environment. There's less access to the server objects, and in a way you're actually running as a client on the server. So it's not a coincidence that the sandbox solutions and the client object model happened at the same generation, because a lot of this was kind of stepping out, not accessing everything on the server, but going through managed interfaces that could be controlled and throttled and managed in that way. So again, not a huge change between 2007 to 2010, but a lot of it was built upon making SharePoint an easier development environment, keeping it up to date with what was going on with the dev tools of the time, and pushing it all out into the enterprises. So that brings us to today. SharePoint 2013 has a very rich set of development interfaces, but they kind of break down into a couple of different areas. One of the most fascinating is the application model. And we talk about SharePoint solutions, we talk about SharePoint features, and all of these from kind of the past. But the application model is an even further step forward from what was done in previous versions for Sandbox, in that many times, or actually preferably, the application itself does not run on the SharePoint infrastructure, which means that you're absolutely in no way can affect the stability of the SharePoint server itself. Maybe the data, but not the infrastructure management. SharePoint 2013 was updated for .NET 4.5, and all the changes that happened in there, things such as asynchronous capabilities, link was updated as needed be, all of those kind of pieces. SharePoint 2013 has really pushed the client-side development process. Very specifically, it's been very focused on moving towards an HTML5 user experience for the web interface. It's been very much pushed to bringing JavaScript to the forefront as a development tool, as you'll see with most of Microsoft's development across the board. There a lot of standardizations kind of being pushed for UX in JavaScript, so don't be surprised with that. The APIs for external access have come into place, so that what was happening with the client object model is now being expanded and extended so that more and more capabilities are there. Again, a lot of this is kind of being pushed by the Office suite for things such as Word and PowerPoint to be able to interface with SharePoint servers, but all that's open for you as well. Workflow is updated to 4.0, and management has become a lot easier and a lot more stable. And one of the big pieces is SharePoint now defaults to claims-based authentication, whereas previously it was forms-based or Windows-based or Kerberos. There were a lot of different pieces. SharePoint is now moving very strongly to a claims-based authentication, OAuth and the like, in order to actually tie in with not being tied just as a on-premises SharePoint server, but SharePoint in 2013 is transitioning to be a services anywhere product, so that it could be in the cloud, it could be in your environment, it could be hosted on outside of your organization. All of these pieces come into play that you can work with. So SharePoint has started out as we mentioned, a team or department level, and now it's actually moved into a situation where you've got all the infrastructure in place, you've got the dev tools, you've got all these capabilities to be a literal world-spanning organization, central point of repository for everything from business processes to information to task lists to teaming to files to everything. So hopefully this helps you understand a little bit about how SharePoint fits in throughout all of its life cycle. How if someone comes up and says, no, I'm not comfortable with you putting an event handler or maybe a new web part on my server, you can show them how things aren't that much of a problem anymore, that things have been solved. And as it all comes forward, you can know that SharePoint has solved a lot of these issues, or if you see somebody who's had to work around these issues in the past in your legacy code, that you can kind of know how you can transition this into the technology of SharePoint 2013.